And I use the opportunity to say that Alessandro, who has introduced Jan Stern, is the new postdoc working in the team, and that he's investigating Pompeii, Ercolano, and Ostia, as well as constructing these GIS maps, because we plan to have this view, this global view of antiquity, ancient world with board games, as well as specific focus, of course, on random sites. So now we will try to have this. Something.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. What I'm going to do in this next hour is try to present the context within which many divination or cultic items were found, and that will hopefully provide us with context to understand what I'll be showing at the end, which is the game boards themselves, which I'm looking forward to having feedback on and comments on, because that's not my focus, but it'll be, let's say, the build-up. In any case, just to kind of get a sense of, we've been excavating in the ancient city of Maresha, which you see over here. It is located 35 kilometers from Ashkelon. It's southwest of Jerusalem. It was originally excavated by Bliss and McAllister between 1898 and 1902. They focused on the Tell. Our excavation is actually in one of the subterranean complexes surrounding the Tell in what we refer to as the lower city. Now, what's unique, or what's, I think, very interesting about the city itself, is that it is surrounded, the lower city in particular, by literally thousands of man-made caves. These man-made caves are where we were excavating. And an important caveat, perhaps, we have no stratigraphy. Okay, and that's very important to note. I can say that from a typological perspective, we can date almost everything from the 3rd to 2nd century BCE, with residual material from Iron Age II and Persian period, but that's not more than 10% of the material we're finding inside the caves. And our focus, my focus today, right now, is going to be in cave system 169, because this happened to be one of the richest of the caves. It's a cave that we've been excavating for the last 16 years. Now, the final report for those 16 years will be coming out, I hope, in the next couple of months. And what's also important to note is its proximity to Subterranean Complex 57, which we published in 2014, and just as important, Area 800, which is this area right over here, which has been identified by Professor Amos Kloner as a temple. Okay, that is significant. Area 57 significance is also its proximity, both to 169 and to 800. And the fact that it was in that cave complex that we discovered the famous Heliodorus inscription, which by, I would say, according to Hanakotin, Delgera, and others, this was where this inscription, or this stele, was placed or found initially in front of a temple and eventually dumped into the cave complex we're describing. Now, why 5,000 caves? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I think it's significant to understand what we're talking about here. This area of the country has a crust of very hard rock called Nari. In antiquity, they understood very quickly if they could penetrate through, make a shaft through that hard rock, underneath it is a chalky substance called kirton. They would use this as their building blocks, bring the blocks to the surface, and build their homes with them on the surface. So what we are finding now are these underground, these subterranean areas that were later converted by the people living on the surface to different types of, let's say, structures, from olive presses to water cisterns to columbaria, and some of them just remained as quarries. At a certain point in time, those subterranean areas become garbage dumps. Basically, either from the debris that was deliberately dumped in there, and I say why deliberately dumped in there, because when we enter into these cave systems, if it was just material that had fallen in, you would expect the material to be in a shape of a cone. But if I have many different rooms, what I find is the material is level across the board. And so it seems like it was a systematic, let's say, dumping of material inside there. And within it, as I said before, about 90% of the material is 3rd to 2nd century BCE. We have a terminus antiquam for Mauritius, which is 107 BCE. That is based on one lead weight. Basically, before that it was 111, 112, but more or less it's associated with the conquest by John Hyrcanus, again reported by Josephus. Now let's look at the cave complex that we're talking about. This is a number of the rooms in the complex we're describing. Notice that spot there. These areas over here, at one time, was the floor in this particular area. And this is where most of the material I'm going to be talking about came from. Now, what did it look like when that was the floor? It looked like this. In other words, these were silos. Okay, the opening of the silos basically were right over there. And this was the floor level at one time. Later on, again, all of this happening in the Hellenistic period. They decided they no longer needed those silos, and they simply quarried through them. You can see the, let's say, horizontal lines here. That's part of the quarry marks, but they continue. You even have one brick that you can still see over here. And again, then it became filled. When we entered into this cave complex, just to get a sense of how much debris was inside, the dirt level, the debris came up to about over here. So we're talking about 4 or 5 meters filled with debris throughout the area. We have some inscriptions. Here's one just on the wall. Zabdada, a Greek name. Not just a name in Greek, it was Idumean. It appears on a list that Rappaport published from a list of Idumean names discovered in Hermopolis. But now let's get into the material that we actually discovered. Here you're seeing a number of small incense burners. Now, we discovered in almost all the cave complexes we've been excavating in Mauritius, we've discovered incense burners. These are more or less, or at least we associate it with domestic cult, right, in various homes. Keeping in mind that everything we're finding inside the caves did not originate in the caves, but rather originated in the dwellings that once existed on the surface that were destroyed and dumped into those caves. Right? Now, in these, what we're seeing here are rather typical. They're for incense. These are, many of them about 20, 25 centimeters high. Most of them, I'd say out of the 81 that we've discovered in this one area, 70 of them are made out of stone, kirton, the local chalk. 11 are made out of ceramic. This is actually one of the more beautiful ones of ceramic. You can see the swan. Many of them are decorated. Some are decorated only on a few sides, so they were probably inside niches. But clearly, let's say, incense burners. Now, some of them are very tiny. The ones you're seeing up here, only about 3 centimeters high, maybe 10 centimeters long. Some of them have depictions of people. The middle one on the bottom there, the Greek letter mu, possibly the, let's say, the goddess, god Minos from Gaza. And there's a parallel to this that Dotan published not long ago. Also, the palm branch appears on the one from Ashdod. But what was the most important of all of these incense burners is the one over here, because it has an inscription on all 4 sides in Greek. And the inscription says Theodosius, dedicated to Artemis in payment of a vow. In other words, what we have here are ex voto incense burners. Only 3 of them had any signs of burning on them. Now again, if I go back to what I said originally, we have small altars in almost all of the different caves. The concentration of 81 of them in one particular area more or less moves us from the idea of a small domestic altar to something where there's a concentration of many of them for some purpose connected to some activity, probably, again, cultic, probably connected to a sanctuary of sorts. Now, the next item that I think is unique, we have many different Kernos lamps. The Kernos lamps are on rings. In this case, what we're looking at are Kernos lamps that are pinched. But in addition to pinched lamps, we also have, on a ring, we also have round, well, let's say kind of bowl-shaped Kernos lamps. Many of them are very large. Some of them are, I would say, smaller. Okay, and again, I'll show you right here what it looks like. Here's in the lab where they were being reconstructed. The larger ones you can see over here. Okay, let's kind of focus on that a bit more. But you can also notice there are some smaller ones over here. This is Einat Ambar, one who's working on the lamps, who's actually publishing them with us. And she is demonstrating, holding one of them on her head. In other words, this is taken, or this pose, let us say, is taken from the Ninuan tablet, or where you have possibly a connection to the Eleusinian mysteries. Clearly, the larger ones could not have been worn on one's head. They are too large. They would have been stationary. But what we have here is an item that one can certainly connect to cultic activity. They resemble, let's say, Kernoi, or let's say you have Kernoi that were cultic in nature, that were found in earlier contexts. Only 25% of these have any signs of burning on them, and 15% of them have slight signs. So in other words, we're talking about 40% that really weren't burnt again at all, but rather they were there possibly in a votive context. Keep in mind, 98% of the lamps that we found, 98% of them have burning on them. We'll talk about the regular, let's say whether they're mold-made or whether they're wheel-made lamps. And 50% of our lamps, and I'm talking about 786 intact lamps that we've found in this cave complex, and over 2,000 fragments. But of the 78 intact, 50% of the lamps are Kernoi. Now that's a percentage that goes way beyond. Let's not, the numbers maybe even, you can say, well, we found a lot of material in here, the numbers are just large. But percentage-wise, 50% is certainly a statement that contributes to, let us say, the impression we have from this complex. Okay, here she is, just a little bit more close-up. Next item. We have 17 phalli. Now, 17 out of 20 phalli that have been found at Marisha. Okay, the phalli are, well, I'm not going to go into whether they're circumcised or not. That's a debate that we have internally, but that's irrelevant for this discussion. It's relevant perhaps to relating to Josephus and his account of what happened here when the conquest took place with John Hyrcanus. But 17 phalli, what do the phalli represent? Well, again, could be fertility. One could say, well, maybe it's just a votive part, but this is the only votive part we're finding, and so unlikely that the people of Marisha suffered from major prostate issues and nothing else. Okay, so in my opinion, at least, I think this is more connected to either fertility, or again, we have the connection to Dionysus, Delos. We have phalli. You have them in Pompeii, and of course, a later context. Possibly representing the evil eye of envy, Fortuna, one go in lots of different directions, and clearly cultic. And here we then have another element. The original is, of course, what you're seeing over here. This is the stone, and it resembles a bread stamp. Unfortunately, the intaglio is too shallow. If this was stamped on bread after the bread had risen, you wouldn't see the impression anymore. We did stamp it onto some clay, and you do get an impression on clay. And then we did an RTI, a reflectance transformation image on it, and we'll see if we can get it a little bit bigger. It becomes a bit clearer. And what we have here is an image of a Ptolemaic eagle, in its talons, lightning bolts perhaps, perhaps in association with Zeus, a wheel to its side. And this resembles, again, there's coinage that we have from this period of time that Alexander Zabinius, the second coin, is a clear parallel to what we're looking at over here. But it's imagery. It's imagery that one can associate with that period of time. Another example, and here you can see the handle. Okay, partially broken, but here the handle itself has a floral image on it. It's the stamp of the handle. But more importantly, what we have here is the original stamp and its impression. Originally we thought, and here's the RTI, which makes it much clearer. Okay, originally we thought we were looking here at Nike. But on closer inspection, okay, here we go. Okay, we noticed there was something that could not be Nike. Okay, this actually brought us to the god who's probably the most ubiquitous in Marisha, the imagery of Eros here. Again, winged. The face is partially disfigured, holding perhaps a torch, maybe reaching towards a standard, and a wreath with two ties coming down, which is imagery that we see also in coins from this period of time. So again, another, let's say, god or deity being mentioned. The last of these I'll show you. Here you see the handles more clearly. Okay, you've got the handle from the top, from the side. The stamp itself, the clay image, and the RTI. Well, what we see here is a horned altar, a bull or a horned animal that's being held, possibly a sacrificial animal, and a hand coming from the side, maybe holding onto the animal's horn, with some grape leaves and grapevines surrounding it. Now, what's interesting about these three, and we have actually more, but I'm just going to show you these, we have no positives of them. As we have stamps, okay, but we don't have any of the positives, and that's again a question that Rajuan had when she was excavating in the Agora in Athens. She had all these molds and didn't have any positives there. And the question, of course, is, or the answer, is connected to the fact that, well, then it must have been done on some sort of material that was not going to last, right? So if it's not bread, because bread would not have made sense here, then possibly a close-grained cake, or maybe even the stamp works on clay, so maybe on clay, but the clay that was unbaked clay, and then you could whitewash it or stucco it, and then it would last if it was in a situation where there was no rain for a couple of generations. In other words, this is the making of plaques, plaques that could have been placed in a votive context in different areas, something that could have been mass-produced, used by the general public, and would have imitated, let's say, the more expensive votive plaques that the wealthy could make. Okay, this is you saw this already, but let's just kind of, because you saw this with the D's material. We have, of course, astragals. Okay, some of them have been drilled, some of them have polished. Bottom line, 63 of them were modified in one way or another. Now, we look at what Greaves talks about, okay, in his article in 2012 on divination, and he says they, astragals, can be connected to divination by lots, the four sides having a name, and the different combination of numbers can be interpreted to have particular significance to the person inquiring. According to Greaves, the three criteria used to suggest divination are, number one, context, which we're starting to develop right now. Number two, their modification, or production in other materials. Well, modification I've just showed you. And inscriptions. So from this, we can then go to say, well, we do have a glass astragal, okay? 11 of them are inscribed, and the name Nike appears on one of them. So letters, a name, glass, modification. We seem to at least meet the criteria that Greaves suggests. And if we turn to Pausanias, okay, when one descends from Bora towards the sea, there's the Boracos River and not a large image of Heracles in a grotto. He too is called Boracos, and he offers an oracle from a list and from astragaloi. Whoever intends to consult the divinity prays in front of the image, and after the prayer he takes up 4 astragaloi and rolls them on the table. For any combination of the astragaloi, the inscription in the list gives an easily accessible explanation of the combination. Now, the last, well, almost the last, aside from the astragaloi, we have tessoi or game pieces. Could be maybe inserts. We originally thought maybe inserts for jewelry, right? There are not that many of them, but in any case, they exist, and that for let's say, completely complements everything else we've been doing. And then we get to the written material. Okay, and I'm only touching on this briefly right now, but this is the work primarily of Esther Eschel and Michal Langlois. But basically we have over 1,200 ostraca in Mauritius. Of those 1,200, 450 in this cave complex alone. Of those 450, 90 in Greek and 360 in Aramaic. Of the 90 in Greek, I can only name the 2 that mention, and again, I can't say these are divination, but they mention holy property, and so there's some connection there in just 2 of them. The vast majority of these 450 are dockets. Okay, they're not so explanatory, but of the 360 Aramaic, 127 of them have a certain type of clause in them that suggests, at least, according to Eschel and Langlois, divination. And that is this certain clause that separates them from the dockets and everything else is the if X then Y, or either this, alternatively that. Okay, hen the hen. That is one clause we see. And the second clause we see is hen min Elohim, in Aramaic, thus is, or it might be from the gods. Okay, these are clear. And again, what you see circled here are the sites in one of, or two of the ostraca that we have. If an illness is put upon X, thus the stumbling block is from or caused by Kos being the Edomian god. If you are hurt by Lilith, okay, and then what is the problem here without going into all the details? These are just, the texts are short. They are not the full, let's say, the full story. Right? Sometimes we only get one clause or part of the clause and we don't get the second part of the clause. So again, there is a possibility that we're talking here of exercises. I don't want to dismiss that. The possibility of, let's say, scribal exercises, or people who are learning to be seers or diviners are learning, and this is part of the school. Notice what was the structure above the cave? Okay, maybe it was a school connected to divining. It's an option that we cannot dismiss. In addition, just to kind of, we have demons mentioned, Tuku, Lilith. The use of generic terms of a seer or a diviner are used as well. And so all of this is giving us the context for, let's say, the game boards, which I'm going to show you momentarily. Final point, we are next to Area 800. Area 800 is I'd say the largest building that has been uncovered at Mauritius so far. Not published yet, but excavated by Professor Amos Kloner. The Heliodorus inscription that I mentioned a minute ago, over here, I think we have it enlarged. Yeah, okay. And without going through the whole story of its discovery, it was believed originally to have been in front of a temple. There's actually a second copy of this inscription that was discovered in the 1950s by someone. By someone meaning discovered, meaning he liberated it from the site, brought it to his house, returned it to the Antiquities Authority in '78, and was rediscovered in the course of the most recent edition of Corpus Inscriptionum. And it is a second copy of this. It's not the whole thing, but the portions that has been recovered is identical to here. So we're talking about two inscriptions. We don't know where that other one was discovered. The person who found it does not remember, but most likely in front of a temple. And again, keep in mind the proximity of 57 and 169 to the temple. Which brings us to, just to kind of sum up before we go to the game boards, 44% of the ostrogals, 63 of them modified, 50% of the lamps being aniconic Carnos lamps, 17 phalli, over 81 incense altars, votive plaques, divination texts, next to a temple, near this inscription. Now let's go to, I'm going to skip over this, you've already seen this. They could be games. What we're showing you now could simply be for entertainment. But the context suggests otherwise. What we have here are a number of the game boards that were found in 169. The two on the left, possibly La Truncoli, but I'm open to suggestions. And the one on the right, in many ways, a little bit more interesting, and that is that it's a two-sided game. Okay, it has, let's say, 30 squares. It resembles, the parallel to this that I found in Israel is a 9th century context at Chatzor. Aharoni claimed that it was Senate. Same type of two-sided board. I'm going to go through this and we can then kind of react. I'm going to show you the other boards now and we'll see what we got. Here is one that was published. This was published in 2014 in Area 57, which was right next to 169. We mention it simply as a game board. You have the image of a woman on the side, but it's a game board that also resembles the Truncoli, and this we just found about 3 months ago, so it's again another example. And the last two, I have no idea. I can give a guess on one of them, and the other one is completely I'm not sure what. We have the two, let's say, circles here. There is no line, but possibly an early example of Mancala. But again, we have no, I understand, no written, let's say, evidence of Mancala existing at this period of time. But I think you at one time at least mentioned the possibility of it existing at this time, but I'm not sure. And this one over here could contain marbles. Okay, and the size of this would contain a small marble. So it could have some sort of a game in there. But again, I have no real idea of what game could, if it is a game at all, could be played there. So that's, I went through it quickly so we can have discussion. I know that it's going to be some discussion.
Any question? Because it's very rich of suggestions.
Sure, I'll go back to the slides if we want to zero in.
About the tabule.
Yeah. So of course it's extremely difficult to identify certain games from just fragments, because let's say the number of board games from antiquity, let's say from Greek and Rome and antiquity, is very limited, rather limited. We know about 5 different games, and perhaps it is not even necessary to attribute a game board to a special game. For example, Polis or La Troncoli are played on a grid, on a kind of a checkerboard. We know, but we do not know whether or not there existed other games that also have been played on checkered boards like this. You know. So this is this is of course you can say this is what you can say is that it is possible to play La Troncoli on this board, but maybe there were also other games that can be played on such a board. We do not know the names or the titles. We are the two-sided board fragment. This is in fact a thing that is very usual in Egypt, very common in Egypt. It's centered on one side and 20 squares on the other. So one would have to have a closer look if this is, as a matter of fact, if this is something like that, and it's centered on one and 20 squares on the other side. Mm-hmm. This is what we find in Egypt, but also on Cyprus we have these games during the first millennium AD. Here we are rather late, and this is extremely interesting because we do not know how long Senet and 20 squares were played. After Pharaonic Egypt, how long they lasted, this is not very easy to tell, but since this is a practically dated context.
Well, certainly in those, what's nice here is that we have 3rd, 2nd century, and it can't be past 107 BC.
Yes.
That's
so this would be extremely interesting if we were able to really identify this fragment as a two-sided game board of Egyptian type. Then, of course, there is these are these grids. And that stone with this figure on it is very, very interesting because of one thing. One might think of something that is not easy to identify, because there are, as a matter of fact, we know that there are close relationships. You mentioned some close relationships between board games and divination. There are several articles about it, but they are not very specific. So we already Stuart Culin at around 1900 he had that publication, Chess and Playing Cards, about the relationship of board games and divination practically throughout the world. He collected examples from Asia, from America, also in this for the exhibition of the 1893 World Exhibition in Chicago. And this is then there are several other articles. Of course, we know of these astragal oracles. These are very well documented. Not only from Pausanias, but there are in Asia Minor, there are several stelae with inscriptions for these astragal oracles, for example. But we do not know very much about the techniques of ancient divination. There are some methods of divination in other contexts, say in southern Africa or in India, for example, still applied nowadays. that resemble, from the material they use, that resemble very much board games. So they use a board, even with squares on it. They put stones on the board. They move these stones around on the board, something like that. So there are methods like this, and it is a possibility also that these are not gaming boards, or some of them perhaps were not used for play, but for divination purposes.
Right. We even have one, just maybe, I didn't mention it, I didn't bring all of the divination texts, but one of the texts refers to houses, and the term houses could also mean places on the divination board as well.
Yes. And especially the one with this portrait, or with this figure on it. So just from this, that's the point I would like to make. One point is that just from the material like this, from these boards like this, we cannot tell whether or not it's a game board or not. As we cannot tell if we find some astragals, we cannot say exactly, is it for divination, or was it for play, or some other, for magic, or an amulet, or whatever. Just from this, we cannot be sure. We cannot tell for sure. Then another point would be, and I discussed this with Véronique already. Sometimes this is when we see that game boards are found in ancient sanctuaries. We tend to be a little bit astonished. Well, did they play within the sanctuary? How come? But this is, as a matter of fact, this is kind of a more or less modern Christian view. You know, that we know from many sources in the Middle Ages and later that the church wanted to stop playing in the church, and they did not want the priests and nuns and so on to play in the monasteries and so on. What tells us that they did. As a matter of fact, they played within the church, they played in the monasteries, but at a certain point the church wanted to abandon this practice. So this is rather new, I think. So and we always have this in mind, that so this separation from play, from cult and rite and a holy place. This is something, let's say, a fundamentalistic Christian thing. And of course also in modern Islamic views this is the same thing. But it doesn't hold true necessarily for antiquity. We have several sources that tell us about people playing in sanctuary. Obviously there was no problem with it. We never heard of any problem with it. So it is not too, I would not be very astonished to find game boards within a sanctuary.
For recreational purposes?
Also for recreational purposes. We do not know what people did in the sanctuaries. Perhaps they did not only go there for votive offerings or cult practices, rituals, something like that. Perhaps also for other things. But for example, in certain rituals and cult practices, we know that, for example, feasts and dinner, eating, drinking was involved also with the whole company. So why not also playing? So I would not be too astonished.
Right. I would even go. What's interesting, what I learned this morning, for example. First of all, this is relatively new to me, for sure, but we found hundreds of small seashells. Mm-hmm. I never associated that with anything that would possibly be a gaming piece. But in retrospect, we have them, we've collected them, we have to count them and add that to our let's say, our data. We have other things that we initially didn't think were in a cultic context. For example, we have hundreds of loom weights. And we assumed we have local or domestic weaving in many of the different subterranean complexes that reflected what was happening on the surface. But I would suggest that possibly, because we have all this material that's related to, let's say, cult, sanctuary, etc., that you may have had an industry that was connected to the temple. Could have been either making garments for the priesthood or for the gods, or even just votive looms. Okay, as a possibility. We have glass grotesque heads that were Phoenician. Okay, not a lot, but I think 3 or 4, which clearly could also be connected in that direction. In other words, I'm always afraid of circular reasoning. In other words, we find one thing and all of a sudden you start feeding into it. On the other hand, the evidence here seems to be overwhelmingly going in the direction of ritual, and hence, even though the game boards, I agree with you, could be many things, it seems to fit that context. But what do you think of these?
This is difficult to tell. You gotta tell from 1.5 holes that this is a Mancala board. Since, as you rightly said, we have no information that Mancala existed at that time in the Hellenistic times, and so this might also be for an offering table to put something into these little depressions or something else. From just 1.5 holes, we cannot tell anything, I think. And with the other 4 holes, this is difficult to tell.
I just want to mention that over a century ago, Mr. McAllister found on the tent similar tablets with grid, but they were inscribed. And one of them was divided into 7 columns, which they interpreted as 7 days of the week. And then it was written in a column, either gamma delta or delta gamma, which is, in Hebrew, God is good luck. And delta gamma could be bad luck. And so I don't know. I have to have it here on my disk computer if you want. I can show it to you later. But maybe there were also kind of, you move the stone or whatever, and let's see if you have good luck or bad luck, or like you go to a wizard or to a witch. Or,
sure.
So just I'm thinking of it. Maybe
no, that's nice.
Look at it again, because I don't know where they are. They're probably hidden somewhere. Maybe they are now in Turkey.
Yeah, that's what I think in the National Museum.
It was under the Ottoman rule, excavated, but they did publish a drawing of them, 2 or 3 of the tablets.
Okay.
And I never thought of them as for games, for divination, but now I was looking at the
that's a nice connection.
Yeah.
That's great. No, I look at it when I get home. Please.
Thank you for this presentation. I was also questions about the comparison of the Greek divination. It is also it also comprises priests involved in divination. You know, from Schwenner, for example, also from Omeromancy and in the temple of Sophnopariunesos, there is the priests who interpreted the responses by Homeric verses, and they also drawn the die, 6 die, and for Astrarontes you call it of course the sanctuary of Heracles Buraikos in Achaia. There is also found this answers, and also the divination, also the Greek divination is founded on if sentences of a binary logic. If this sign is shown, so this other thing will be happen. And I wanted to ask you about Aramean divination. In these tables, if you they put these astros, these nuchal bones that you found, if there are some response, some set of answers similar to this we have for Greek text. And if you now, for example, names of sites like as you have for Greek, also from Pollux, from literary sources, or what is the point of our...
Well, we have generic terms like city, house, region, things like that, but nothing specific in terms of a toponym. You have relationships, I mean, they relate to almost everything you would expect in daily life. In other words, from building your house and those property issues, to marriage issues, to health issues. I would say, again, the example I gave here was just one, but the bottom line is they go in different directions. If you do this, then Lilit or Ukutu or Kos is mentioned 6 times, the local god, but he's not the only god, and you have consequences for what you're doing. But it deals to a large extent with day-to-day life. There's also reference to a comet. If you see a comet in the sky, what should you do? Okay, appropriate for maybe tomorrow. But so it's, again, not surprising. The ancients saw in everything, you know, a divine element, let us say, that influenced them in one way or another, and they were looking for ways of perhaps integrating them, maybe even say controlling them if it's possible.
And from origins, you know, this is drawn eastward. There is an interaction with the Semitic or Semitic divinatory system, so it was rather a Greek influence.
I think there's actually the parallels we have here are to Mesopotamian omen texts. Okay, that's we find it again. There, the texts are much fuller. Okay, again, as I said before, we don't have many full texts. That's why this could be just divination exercises. In any case, I think it's connected, but you have sometimes half the clause, sometimes the verb is missing. So it's fragmentary, and again, and that's 127 out of 450. Many of them are just dockets, but leaving those aside, of the divinatory material, again, it's still a work in progress. Let me put it that way. There will be, again, we have a publication coming out, I hope in the next couple of months, that'll be dealing with 169 for the first 16 years. And there will be a chapter on the divination text there, along with many of the other things I've described here. None of us believe it's the end story. Okay, this is, even though it's 21 chapters, it's going to, I think, be the beginning of many more articles and books that we expect to come out of it. No one's expecting their chapter to be the final word on it, but rather for it to be maybe a jumping off point for many more, for discussions and for critiques and for us to hopefully proceed further on it.
But in your academia website, there's your beautiful paper with ST, which gives preliminary idea if anybody wants. So. Right.
On academia.edu, we have already, we've published one article, actually one in Hebrew, also one in English. But sorry?
Yes, you said you can put the marbles in the one on the right?
This will, yes, a marble will fit there. We found actually one marble, stone, it was made of stone. But
there are scratches, there are lines? Or no?
There's also scratches and lines. And again, I'm at a loss. It didn't look like a regular block. We didn't throw it away, but
but there are scratch lines.
Yeah, there are lines going across over here. It looks like there's a border over here. There's something there, but you know, was it someone doodling or was it something more than that?
Something like that in Megiddo. And the one before, can you look before? What's the size of the one on the right?
The one on the right is about this big. I just took it from in the field. It's about this large.
Right.
Okay, so we're talking about what's unique here is, number one, we have a certain type of context, not an exact context, but at least a context within a couple of hundred years. Number two, they're portable. In other words, we're not talking about something that was done on the pavement or on the side of a building, which could have been from a much later period. We're talking about something that we can give relatively clear context for, and that's, I think, what's unique here.
And it's not really broken, is it?
No, it's. I think it's chipped, not broken.
You got three lines of 10 probably.
You know what? I did it very quickly, and I think it's more than 10. But
11.
Yeah, I think it's more than 10.
Okay. What's
Yeah, 3 lines of 10 would have been nice, but no. Can't always get what you want.
So, but if I understand you well, you wonder whether it's the end of a board, or or whether it was larger. What do you mean?
It looks like it was chipped. There could have been another set on top. It's chipped there.
And this one, only one side this time?
Yes, the only one that was two-sided was the one I showed you. Right, what possibly looks like Senate.
Did you look at the size of the case? Squares. The squares. Because we had discussions with Thomas, who is collecting material from Aventicum, and he's measuring the size of the squares, which is good because it shows whether it's a normative production or not. And can you do something like this? Maybe you could give a clue.
We'll just go back to this one.
Provide an information.
Even here you have something that was like scratched a bit, but they seem to have been done almost, I don't want to say arbitrarily, but not carefully, for sure, right? You don't see any type of this. The lines are not necessarily parallel. They're not, let's say, on the same. They're not the same size at all. Here you have some sort of uniformity. Then even over here, but this and this one and the others seem to have been done quickly. Okay, which I'm not sure if you're going to say, well, is it a game board that was being used spontaneously, or was it something that was being reused? It's it's not made of a material that we have basalt, and people do, for certain items we have grinding material from basalt. You have harder limestone if it was something that was going to be utilized time and time again. So it's not I don't call it even semi-precious material. It's something that was very local, and anybody could have done within 5 minutes.
So this is a rather soft stone.
It's like chalk. It's like chalk.
Okay.
So everything. So therefore, and that's, by the way, that applies to the altars. That applies to the buildings. The homes above were made of chalk. That's why we have the caves. You chisel the chalk out to build your house, and then you have the cave as a byproduct.
For instance, the one on the bottom left, what do you think? Does it resemble anything,
It's a grid that was destroyed or smudged in antiquity, but why? Anyone's guess.
But does it look like something, or not at all?
No, like this, not at all. Like this, not at all.
Was smashed later on?
No, I don't think so. I think it was smashed back then. I think we found it. It came out of the ground like that.
So it was.
It could have been smashed as it was thrown into the cave. Who knows? I don't know. But it wasn't. I don't think it was a modern destruction. Just like the Heliodorus, you can see. A new break is pretty easy to determine.
Another interesting information would be the depth.
That we have.
How heavy it is also.
Yeah. I don't have it here, but
yes, of course. But it would be interesting to compare. You can provide the information.
For sure. That's easy enough for the database. If that's important, then we send it all. All right. Well,
but what is fascinating is that you have the reversible one. So if one of the series for sure could be game, like
could be Senate,
the 20 case, then it incites us to think that maybe one of the others could be as well.
Right, but we checked. I mean, we would have noticed at this point. I can tell you that is the only one. Yes. Since we found that one, we checked all of them.
But the last one you found, if it is chipped.
This one here, yeah.
Could be something.
It's not even cleaned. It was it was not done in the lab. It was just done in the field, photographed quickly, so I'd have it for this.
It could be.
Yeah, you need to check almost if there is some sort of cross on the 27. If you really, with a microscope or something. Because if there is a marking on 27 or something that would be 27, then you're sure to have a sense.
You're talking about
that one in Megiddo.
You're talking about this over here.
No, the other one. Yeah, this one.
On the right.
The ones with the hole.
I see what you're. I understand what you're saying. This over here possibly being.
Well, I don't know which way it goes.
Okay. Over here too. Okay. Interesting. All right.
And so my last question to Ulrich, looking at these and with the discussion we had, for you, when is a game a game? When is a board game or graffito on a stone game? How can you? What are the criteria for you that you need to gather to be sure on it? Where does it start? I mean, is it that you find the dice with it? Is it that you find
this helps.
The counter? Yes. But he found counters.
Yeah, this helps if you find pieces and dice with it. Of course, this helps. But it should be complete, so that it should be complete, so that you really can determine how many the structure of the structure. So how many squares are there? How many points, for example? And can you compare it to something you know?
Yeah.
This is always. This is why fragmented grids is difficult to tell something. For example, the Ludus Duodecim Scriptorum boards for the Roman type of backgammon, they are so particular, so special, that you will, even from a fragment, you will recognize it. You just need one corner and you know what it is. Grids is more difficult, of course. So it depends on the game, and but once again, we from the literary sources we just know about 5 games, something like that, or even less, and so we don't know if there were other games, especially in in a context like this, where you have people coming also from the Orient, perhaps, or there are contacts to the Near East, perhaps, and contacts to Egypt, perhaps. So we are not in Rome, or in Athens, and even there were many people from abroad around. So there might also be a certain impact from other cultural areas. Also, what games are concerned.
Yes, because what was interesting is that you said you could touch the arrival of the Greeks in your material. Huh?
Well, I would say that we can say that the Greek influence at Mauritius, from the Ostracal that we've found, Abner Ecker has pointed out that you see a change, not necessarily the arrival of the Greeks, but the arrival of Greek influence on commercial activity. Yeah. Starting around the year 200, we start seeing a lot of use of the words like agronomos and even agronomy and different. We have a sarcoma, for measuring liquids and things like that can be dated from that period of time. You don't see it so much before that.
More that, I think under the rule of Alexandria, you can see influence coming from there, which is Hellenistic, but in the Ptolemaic filter, I would say.
I have one last question. It's for all of you. I'm thinking of Attilio. Until now, when we speak of game, board games, dice game, we thought of astragaloi, we thought of the board itself, the counter, not the counter. What about the fritilli? So what about a device used to throw the dice or whatever? And because we have discussions with Attilio about it, and in fact it struck me that we have not identified something that could be that. But it's another question: is it necessary? And we know it's not necessary. You can throw dice without having a goblet to throw it. But we know from text, Roman period, that they used to. And it's very difficult to identify archaeologically. There's much
I'm trying to think of.
But
I wish if they had bowls, we have something that would a certain type of bowl. But no, I can't think of it.
You have so many bowls, you can spare some.
I can spare some for it. That's true. That's true. No.
So my question also to Mariana, there's nothing like this.
Well, in Megiddo, we have a piece of basalt, like if it was a basin. Problem is there's one side missing. So it goes down like that, and a little side. And when you put astragal on the top, they roll up, come back in the middle. That's one, so that would work. We tried it, it works.
Wow.
It's useless. It's
like in lottery, that you wait.
Yeah, but it just goes down and back like that. And it's useless as a vessel or whatever.
Wow.
It's out of context, but it's, it's 300 or 400 kilos.
Well,
It's,
that's serious.
and it's awesome. And there are cuts all around as well. So we published it like that, maybe that's what it is. But no one has come up with anything else. But it would be like
I wish we had one. It would be very nice. But we still have 2 more years in the site.
But
Maybe.
as Véronique said, you have to keep,
Right. Very good.
So it was just to raise this question because it's also interesting to think of what we have not found.
Right, exactly.
And because we compare, and by comparison we know it.
Sure, sometimes you don't know what you're looking
But
for.
maybe something very cultural.
No, the
Maybe
shells are a
there's
perfect
something
example.
That happens, that takes place on the environment
I never
period.
thought of shells as counters, and now
Yeah.
we'll go back and count them because
You have shells.
with loads of shells. We find the broken shells inside our plaster, and so we assumed that they were used. Oh, okay, they had the shells here and there. They broke them. They made them for the frescoes and things like that, and the rest maybe for mementos. We also have shark's teeth, but that doesn't. What are you going to do with that? There's no sharks in Mauritius. So just think, okay, people brought them as mementos, but now it's a different perspective.
Speaking of a board, and so I can announce, maybe give me your data for tomorrow. As you know, tomorrow Fabio organizes a wonderful workshop, a 2-day workshop on the transmission of astrological and divination and magical knowledge. It's here again at 9 o'clock. And within these reflections about astrology, we found out that in fact sometimes in the sources they mention boards as well, with pesoi as well, but it is used for astrology. It is used for something else. So that's a question also for your material. Could you imagine another use?
There's only one that I'll show you tomorrow that has a relationship to, let's say, comets. But there's no direct mention of pesoi or anything else. It's just an observation of a comet coming across with some reference to the gods to deemed it necessary or something of that sort. There's nothing connected to astrovoloi or anything like that in the text. But it's a short text. It's maybe 3 lines. All right. Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we have again a pause, and so we can change computer.